Are you guys bored of with REST implementation? You would have recently heard about the GraphQL and how Facebook has used GraphQL in implementing their mobile application. If you don't know about the GraphQL, you can check out my video about GraphQL. In this particular video, we are going to create a Spring Boot application with GraphQL, and let's see what kind of magic GraphQL provides. Let's get started. Press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss any update from Tech Primers. Just to set the context, GraphQL is a query language similar to REST. It is not any database. The name sounds something different because it is named as GraphQL. However, it is just graph query language. It is just another language for your API. Similar to how we created REST implementation or the REST platform or the architecture, GraphQL is another architecture or the specification which you can use. Let's see how we can use GraphQL in a Spring Boot application and what it provides. This particular example which I am going to create was provided by Basant. I have used his particular code which he gave me. I'm using his implementation. I'm not going to use exactly his project, but I'm going to use a different implementation. He had provided me with the movies implementation. So he has a movie database and we can query the movie database with GraphQL in a Spring Boot application. What I'm going to create is I'm going to create a book repository so we can query that bookstore and we can see how we can use it in Spring Boot. Thank you, Basant. So he saved most of my time in exploring about GraphQL. He had created and given me a repository and he uploaded it into GitHub. So I have been using that. So this is the repository which he had created. So I will give the link for this in the description as well, and also I'll give the link in the description for the project which I am going to create. So let's start off, right? As usual, we are going to go to Spring Initializer. I'm going to use the Spring Boot 1.5.9. The group ID for our project is com tech primers. Let's say I'll just say com tech primers GraphQL. The artifact, I'm going to name it as Spring Boot GraphQL example. The dependencies which we require are, I'm going to use the REST controller, right? So I'm going to say Spring MVC. So I'm just adding web. So web will include Spring MVC in that. If you notice, web has the Spring MVC along with the Tomcat. So this is going to have embedded Tomcat because it's a Spring Boot application. I'm going to use the HSQL database for storing the book repository. I'm going to use Lombok. Lombok is the compile time annotation processor. I'm going to create a model called book. For that, I'm going to use the Lombok annotation. That's it from the Spring Initializer. We need to add the Spring Boot GraphQL dependency that I will add it directly in the project. Let me unzip and open this in the IntelliJ meanwhile. The project is unzipped. Let me open it in IntelliJ. I'll just say open. The project is getting imported. Meanwhile, let's see what is there in the POM XML. The POM has the web. I think I also need the JPA, right? So let me include the Spring Boot JPA as well. So I need the JPA because I'm going to use JPA to access the data from the database, the HSQL database. So I'm going to add the JPA as well. So I'll not include the version. So let Spring Boot figure out what version it needs. So we need the JPA. We are going to use the web, Spring Boot Startup Web. We are using HSQL database and we are using Lombok, and there is a dependency for test. That's okay. Now we need to add the dependency for the GraphQL. So I already have the GraphQL dependencies injected into my live template. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my live template and this is going to add the dependency. So these two are the dependencies which we need to add for supporting GraphQL in Spring Boot. So this is created by GraphQL. GraphQL is a query language created by Facebook, and this jars are created by GraphQL themselves. So let's go and create the project. So this is the project structure as we already know. I'm going to use some other port. So I don't have the default port as free. So I'm going to use the port, let's say 8091. I'm going to use the port 8091. 8080 is already used by my Jenkins, which is running in my machine, so I'm not going to disturb that. Let's go ahead and create the packages, right? What packages do we need? We need a repository, obviously, for storing the data. What else we need? We need a model package. We need a resource, basically the controller. I'm going to call it as a resource, so I'll just say resource because it's a REST resource. And we need services, right? I'll create service. So let's start off with creating the schema for the GraphQL database. So I'm going to create something called books.graphql. So this is going to have the schema which we need for exposing the REST endpoint. So what is a schema, right? So there are different concepts inside the schema of a GraphQL. So we have queries and we have mutations. We are going to see queries in this particular video. Let's create some schema. We need to define them as types. So we need a book type. So we are going to create a book repository, right? So we need a book type. So I'm going to create a type called book, and I'm going to have some variables, or basically these are data for that particular book, or the metadata of the book. So ISN, let's say ISN is the metadata for which I wanted, and this is going to be a string, so I'll just define it as a string. We also need the title. I'll just say title also as string. We need the publisher, and we need the author. So author can be more number of people, right? So I'm going to define it as an array. So I can define the array like this. I have authors, and also I need the published date. I'll just make it a string for now. So I need the ISIN, title, publisher, authors, and the published date. So I have these as my book. Now I need to expose my final query, right? I need to expose my query. So I need some type of message which the user needs to send me. So what type of query the user needs to send me is, the user can select either all books, right? I'm going to say the user can send me all books, and this should return me list of books. And also the user should be able to send me a book which can be expecting an ID, and this could be of type book. So we will see this in detail once we create that query. So what we are going to do is, this gets converted into something like this in the GraphQL. If you see this, right? So this is the final GraphQL language or the query which the user will be providing, and in order to create this we need the schema, and this is nothing but the schema. So we have done the query. Now we need the schema. So we need to define the schema, saying what type of schema it is, and I'm going to provide the schema as query. Done, right? So we have created a schema which is going to have query. So we need to provide the query to this particular application. And what type of queries we can provide? We can provide either all books, or we can provide a specific book. And what type of data the book has, these are the different type of objects the book can accept. So let's now create the resource, right? Let's now start off with the resource. I'm going to name the resource as book resource, like how we do. This is going to be a REST controller as usual using the Spring MVC. And we are going to map this as request mapping as, let's say, books. So I'm just going to say as REST/books, right? I'll just say REST/books. That's it. I'm not going to add anything else. Here I'm going to add some post mapping, and this post mapping needs to return something. Let's see what is that it is going to return, and we need the books, right? I'll just create a book. So we need to get the body, so it's going to be request body, and this is going to be the query which the user is going to provide, right? And let's fill this later on. Let's come back to the model. We need a model. We have the book model. I'm going to create the book model, and I'm going to use the Lombok Before that, I'm going to mark this as table and entity because we need to use the same model to persist into the database. I'm going to use Spring JPA, so I'm marking it as table and entity. Let's add some fields. The ID field is going to be ISN. So we also have other fields. We have the title, we have the publisher, we also have the authors, we also finally have the published date. Now I'm going to use Lombok for annotation processing. I'm not going to create the getters and setters. I'm just going to say I need the noargs constructor, I need the allargs constructor, I need some getters and setters. So I'll just say getters and setters. That's it, right? I don't need anything else. I've added all, I guess. Now I need to create a repository, the JPA repository. I'm going to create it as book repository, and this is going to be an interface, and this is going to implement JPA repository with book as my model. And what is the primary key? The primary key is going to be a string because it is ID and we have marked it as string. And let's import this. That's it. So our repository is done, our model is done, our resource is also almost done. Now we need to create different services. So there is the concept of data fetchers in the GraphQL. So we can write a GraphQL service. So I'm going to write this as a service. This GraphQL service needs to load the data, right? So we need to initialize the GraphQL service or the GraphQL with whatever we added here. So whatever schema we created, we need to inject that into the GraphQL. So we need to have a resource here. I'm going to create a resource. I'm going to add the class path books.graphql. Yep, the name is correct. So this will be loaded as a resource. Now what else do we need? So we are going to add a post construct which is going to be called when we have the GraphQL service initialized. So I'm just going to name it as a load schema. What I have done here is I have already injected that into my live template. I'm going to just say load GraphQL. This is going to add me the code which I need for loading the data into the GraphQL. So this code is going to be the same for any GraphQL data load. So let's see what this code does. So I'm going to use the resource. I need to get that file, which is nothing but the GraphQL resource or the schema. So this is the GraphQL schema. We need to load the schema into the GraphQL service. Once the file is retrieved, we need to use the file to parse it. So what we do here is we have it named as schema file. There is a schema parser provided by GraphQL. So if you see here, this is provided by GraphQL API, and we are passing that particular file and loading it into a type definition registry, which can be used by GraphQL. So GraphQL will refer to this registry which has the data of this particular file, and it will keep track of what all objects are there and what all objects you are requesting. So based on that, it will provide a keep a track of it. So that is what happening. That is what is happening here. The next one is the runtime wiring. So we need to wire these schemas, right? What needs to be mapped to what. So that will be happening in the runtime wiring, which we need to implement now. So I'll just create a runtime wiring method. Let's implement that in a while. Meanwhile, once the wiring is done, we need to provide the wiring and the registry to the GraphQL schema and make it executable. The same schema needs to be built finally, and we need to build that as a GraphQL. So let me create that GraphQL. So GraphQL is a public API. This is a public API. If you go inside, this is a public API provided by the GraphQL team for our usage. So we need to execute any query on this particular API. So this is the API which is exposed to everybody. We will have to use this from our resource. So let's see how to provide now the runtime wiring, right? So runtime wiring is having a API called new runtime wiring.build. So this is going to build our runtime wiring. However, we need to provide what type of wiring we need to add. So we have provided two types of objects, right? So if you notice the books.graphql, we have two types of queries, right? All books and books. So we need to add some data fetches. So how does the API or the GraphQL know which table to get what data from, right? That is what we need to map in the runtime wiring. So now we need to add the schema type, and we need to add these all books and books to that particular schema type, right? So we are going to add that into the runtime wiring here. I'm going to say type, and we are going to use this particular method where we can pass the type name and what type of operation we want to perform, and it is basically a builder. So we need to have query, that's the schema which we are going to use, right? Schema type, and we need to provide what type of wiring we need. So I'm going to say type wiring, and this type wiring we need to provide different data fetches. So in our case we have two types of data fetches. One is the all books, so I'm going to say data fetches. We need to provide a data fetcher here. So data fetcher is another class which we need to provide here along with what type of name we have. So all books is the name, right? So if we go here, all books is the name which we have here, and we are going to provide a data fetcher here. So I'm going to say all books data fetcher. We need to write this particular implementation. Let's do that later. And I also need the book. That's what we have, right? Yeah, the book one. So I have a book, and I'll just say book data fetcher. Finally, I need to build this so that it can be returned. Let me say return, but I think I can replace this as like this. I need to create these data fetchers. What I'll do is I'll just create these data fetchers. I'm going to call this as all book data fetcher, and this I'm going to call it as book data fetcher, and these we need to inject it here. These can be created as a service, so let's create that. I'll just do an auto wire, and then we can go ahead and create them. So once I implement it, you will know why we need the data fetcher. So for now, understand that we need to provide the mapping for the schema to fetch the data. If somebody calls all books, if somebody is providing all books in the query, how does it fetch the data? That is what we are going to do here. I'm going to create a new package inside service called the data fetcher. Let's create these classes inside those. And these data fetchers need to be a component. They need to implement the data fetcher interface. So this is the book one, so I just need to provide the book here. I'm going to provide the book, and let's implement this data fetcher. Let's go to the all books same way. This needs to implement same the data fetcher, but here we need to provide the list of books. If you notice here, we need to provide the list of books, right? So we will provide the list of books here. So list of books, because this can return a list. Let's implement these methods. So first let's go to the all book data fetcher. So what do we need in the all book data fetchers? Basically it needs everything, isn't it? We need to inject the, I'll make it as add component. We need to inject the repository here so that we can retrieve the data from the book repository. So we will use the book repository directly. So this will act like an abstraction to the repository. So the data fetchers are like service component which is going to interact with the repository, and it is going to get the data for us. So using the book repository, I'm going to do a find all. So irrespective of what type of data fetching your environment you are setting, it is going to retrieve all the data from the database. And how GraphQL does that is based on the parameters passed from the schema, it automatically filters out. So let's go to the book data center now. We need to do the same. We need to auto-wire the book repository because we have a single repository, right? We have a single repository using which we are going to get the data. Notice here in the book repository, we are going to find only the one which is based on the ISIN number, right? Which is based on the ISIN. So how will we get that? So from the data fetching environment, we can retrieve it using get argument. We can get it using the get argument, and this ID is nothing but the value which we have ported here. So we had mentioned that provide a book ID and we will provide it, and that is what is here. And this is going to be the ISN. This will be a string. And using that ISN, we are going to go to the book repository and we are getting it because the primary key is a string which we have defined in the book here. Yes. Right. Now we have created the all book fetcher. We have created the book data fetcher. Now we have to, okay, what we did we do here. Okay, we don't need to build it here, right? Okay, so I have built it already. So that is it. We have created the runtime wiring in the service. Now we need to provide the service for the resource. So I'll just expose a get method, get GraphQL. Okay, so I'll just expose this GraphQL. So I'll just make this as private so that nobody knows that it is there. So this particular GraphQL service can be exposed to the resource now. So the books resource now will be using the GraphQL service. So from the GraphQL service, what we need to do is we need to provide the, we need to get the GraphQL and we need to execute that. So we can directly execute it and we need to provide what query it is. That's it. So we are using the GraphQL service to get the GraphQL public API and using the execute method to provide the query. So the query will be nothing but the query which we will be providing from the postman. So let's see that. I think we are almost done, right? So we have, okay, we didn't push the response back, isn't it? So we get the response in an execution result. From this execution result, we can directly push it. So either we can extract it out. So we can do a get data and extract it out, or we can directly give that. So if like there are errors, right, we won't be able to track if there is a get data. What we are going to provide is we are going to provide the whole execution result. We are going to wrap that into the response object. We are going to use the response entity. Let's mark it as object of type. We need to provide the execution result and also what type of response it is. So we are going to say HTTP status okay. I'll just say okay, and let me change this to response type of object. That's it. So we can remove this now. So what we have done in the resources, we are using the GraphQL service to get that particular public API and execute the query which we received from the res/books. Using that, we get the execution result, and that execution result we are wrapping up into a response entity so that we can get that back in the UI or the client side. So I'll just summarize what we have done here. We have created a model called book. We created a JPA for storing this. We have created a book resource where we are using the GraphQL service. Inside the GraphQL service, we are loading the schema into the GraphQL API. This is the GraphQL public API where we have to load the schema. In order to load that, we need to wire it in the runtime using the runtime wiring provided by the GraphQL API. We need to provide the schemas and inject the data fetchers which fetches the data. We have created two data fetchers, one called the book data fetcher which will query based on a particular ISIN. The other one is the all books data fetcher. It is going to query all the books from the database. And also we need to load the data back into the database, right? We have not implemented that. Let me write one more method here. So what I will do is I'll do a load of load data into HSQL. Let me load the data into the HSQL. Let me do a void. We need to get the, I'll just auto wire the book repository because we need to load the data into the book repository, isn't it? Let's load some book information. So I'll just use the stream API. I'm going to use stream.auth and we need to provide different books. From the books, I'm going to do a for each. For every book, I'll just save it into the book repository. So that is what we are going to do, but we need to provide the book, right? What is this book? What is this? We need to provide the book. I'll just create multiple books. Let's create some books, right? I don't know the name of some books. Let's go and query some books here. Let's do some cloud books. Let's get some name of the cloud book so that we can use it. Okay, let's use this book. Okay, book of clouds. Who wrote this? Okay, we need to provide an ISIN. So the ISIN number we can provide, let's say, as 123. For simplicity, I'll just provide that. We need to provide the title. Didn't I query it? Okay. Then the publisher, it is Kindle. Let's do it as Kindle edition. Now we need to provide the authors. I'll just add the author name. Who's the author? Author is Cole. Okay. Let's add the author. So there is only one author, so I'm going to leave that as is. The published date, we need to give the published date. Where is the published date? Published date, published date. Let's make it simple, right? I'm just going to add it as let's say November 2017. Similarly, I'm going to add some few more books. For simplicity, I'll just create some. Let's see. I'll just say ISIN as 124. Let's say I'll just say cloud architecture and engineering. I'll just say, oh, really? For simplicity, I'll just add some names which we can relate it. Let's add one more book. Let's add 3 books. Okay, so we are creating 3 different books and injecting that into the repository here. So before auto wiring the GraphQL, we are going to load the data into the HSQL database. Load books into the book repository. So that's all, I guess. Apart from that, we have created the books schema for the GraphQL, which can be loaded into the GraphQL API. And also I have changed the port number here, server.port as 8091, so that the Spring Boot application runs on this particular port. Let me start the Spring Boot application. Okay, this is showing an error because I have Java 9 configured. Let me change it to Java 8. Let me do a clean install so that I don't have anything. The build failed due to some test case, but my clean install got succeeded. Let me run this particular build. So I'm going to run this Spring Boot main class so that it can start the Tomcat. So this is using the embedded Tomcat. As you guys know, it is a Spring Boot application. So let's check. If you notice here, there is an error here. Let's check what is the error. The error says there is a schema problem which is null. Let's check what is happening in the schema. I think I know what the problem is. Here we have put books instead of book. So let's try this once again now. Yep, the Spring Boot application is up now and it is running at a 8091, and you can see our REST endpoint is registered. Let's go to Postman. So I'm going to use Postman to query the post. So the URL which we are going to access is localhost colon 8091 because that is my port number, and we are going to use rest/books. Is it books or book? Let me go and check. It's called books, so I'm just saying books, and we need to provide a body, and it's going to be a raw message and it is going to be text. We need to provide text, and we need to create this GraphQL now. So based on how the schema is defined, we have to create something similar. So we need to provide a query and we need to provide something similar. So let's add the schema here. Initially, let's go and get all books. We need all books, right, for the first time. Inside the books, we need to provide what all fields we need. So inside the book, we have ISIN, title, publisher, authors, right? Let's do only ISN and let's say title. If we query this, this should return all the books. There are 3 books now. It should return all the 3 books with the corresponding ISN and the title. Let's do the send now. And if you notice here, we got the response, and this response contains all books, whatever we said we wanted, and it is providing ISIN and title. I also need the authors, right? Let's provide authors here. Notice here, I'm not changing my REST endpoint. However, I'm changing whatever I'm posting here. Based on whatever I'm posting, my response is going to change. Notice here, the authors is now present. Same way, if I need the publisher, I can provide the publisher and also the published date. When I say all these, all those information are going to get populated. If I don't want any information, I can remove that. So let's say if I don't want anything else, I just want the ISN and published date, it can do that as well. Right? Now we got the all books. We tested the all books and all books is working fine. So this is what GraphQL can provide. So GraphQL is powerful because you have a single REST endpoint. We did have only one REST endpoint, but we control the responses based on that. Now we can provide the book as well. If we need to query based on a particular ISN, we know what is an ISN. We know an ISN of a book. We can do that as well. So we can provide the book. We can provide it like this. We can provide a ISN. What is the ISN? Let's say 123. That's it. If we provide this, we can still provide what I want from that ISN. So I want the title of the book. If let's say I want only the title, I can just say title and let's query this. And if you notice here, it provided the title of this particular book, which is 123. I also need the authors. I also need the publisher. Let's see what happens. Notice here, the book information came as we saw. Let's change this to 124. This is going to return the book information of ISN 124. Notice here we have not changed the REST endpoint. The resource is still the same, just that the value which we provided or the schema which we provided is completely different. So this is GraphQL. So this is the graph query language. Now I wanted all books along with the books. What do I need? I can do that as well. Since we have created the schema in such a way that we can provide all books and books at the same time. We can do this. We can provide this as well. You can say title and let's say authors. Notice here, all books is going to return all my books. Along with the all books, there is going to be one more block called book that is going to return a specific book. So with a single REST endpoint, you can control the data which is coming in. So the data model which we get is controlled based on whatever we pass here. This is why GraphQL is very powerful. If you don't know, GraphQL is used by our Facebook application. The mobile application inside your Facebook has only one REST endpoint, and GraphQL is the technology which is powering Facebook. So this is how you can create a GraphQL in a Spring Boot application. So I'll just summarize what we did in this particular video. So what we did to create a Spring Boot application with GraphQL, we created a GraphQL schema, which is nothing but this schema. We created a schema which has a query. We are going to use query type to query the GraphQL database. And there are two different query types. One is all books and one is book. So those are the two different types. Book is going to have ISN, title, publisher, authors, and then published date. We are going to create a model called book. We created a model called book. Book repository is used to query the book. We are using the JPA, Spring JPA here. And we are going to expose the resource as res/books. Inside that we have a post method. So we have a post mapping here. In the post mapping, we are going to get the body, which is nothing but the message which we passed here. This is nothing but the request body, and that particular request body we are getting as a query. That particular query needs to be provided to the Graph API. In order to create a Graph API, we are creating a GraphQL service. Inside the GraphQL service, we are automatically loading the data into the HSQL database. We have loaded some 3 book information into the HSQL database using the book repository. Then we need to load the data into the GraphQL, not the data as such, but the schema. We need to parse the schema. So we are parsing that using these statements. We need to build the schema now. Inside that, we are creating a runtime wiring. When we create the runtime wiring, we map that with the GraphQL schema which we created, and we provide what type of data fetches we need to add for each query here. We are providing different data fetches for what type of wiring. So for all books, we are creating a all books data fetcher, which is going to retrieve all the repository information. So which is going to fetch all the data from the book repository. The other one is the book data fetcher, which is going to query only the particular ISN number. So that is what we have done in the GraphQL service. We have exposed a get GraphQL to provide the API back to the resource here. So that is all we did. Apart from that, I just created a different port for the Spring Boot application. And we started off with this. Using the Postman, we created a body. We created a request body here for this particular REST URL with post mapping. We did not add anything else. We just added a raw text with this body. And based on this, if we query, we can see that. Let me modify this. I think I had added something here. So based on this, if we query, we can see the response which is successful here. So this is how you can create a GraphQL versus Spring integration. So I hope you guys understood what is GraphQL and how we can use GraphQL in a Spring Boot application. Do let me know how whether you guys understood or not, or let me know what I need to do. In the next video, what I will do is I'll try to create data into the GraphQL database or data into the HSQL database. In this particular video, we did only get all. We did only the fetching part from the GraphQL. In the next video, I'll just show you how to do create and delete or even the update. That's it for this particular video. I hope you guys like the video. If you like the video, go ahead and like it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, go ahead and subscribe to it. Meet you again in the next video. Thank you very much.